joining us as the next few minutes pass. So bear with us on that front. Greetings, everyone, and Huan Ying, for those of you whose Mandarin is a lot better than mine. My name's Will Wakeling. I'm the Dean of Libraries here at Northeastern, and I want to welcome you to this, the latest in our season of Meet the Author events this year where we celebrate 20 years of Snell Library. We think this is a great way to be celebrating the library as a place where people meet to discuss a whole range of the sorts of issues that crop up in the Meet the Author series. The mission of that series is to encourage dialogue in significant contemporary questions and bring together faculty, students, and staff to debate and discuss these issues. And this event today is just perfectly attuned to that mission. But first, let me say some thank yous. First of all, I want to thank the members, as usual, of the library's Programming and Communications Committee, who work so hard to bring these events and organize them, bring them off. But special thanks also today to our co-sponsors. Northeastern's bookstore, once again, is collaborating with us on this event, and we thank them. And a special thank you to the NU Asian American Center, who are also co-sponsoring this event. And if there are people here from that, hi, good to see you again. Now then, a quick reminder, by the way, we're recording today's event. You can become a library supporter to help us with the logistics of that. We're filming to broadcast to Northeastern's YouTube and iTunes University channels. Some of the previous recordings of these events have been really quite busy, trafficked on YouTube, and I'm sure we can expect the same today. We appreciate your feedback, either if you look at those recordings or after the event itself. So there are some cards that'll be handed out that we can ask you to fill in as well for comment. Okay, so now I get to do the best bit, which is introduce today's distinguished author, Deborah Fallows. Deb Fallows is the author of Dreaming in Chinese. She's lived in Shanghai and Beijing and traveled throughout China for 3 years with her husband, the writer James Fallows. She's a Harvard grad, has a PhD in linguistics from the University of Texas in Austin. Okay, I can't imagine what that did to her accent. However, most recently, she's worked as a senior research fellow for the Pew Internet and American Life project, which is absolutely fascinating, and as a data architect director for Oxygen Media. She's got a home in the US. When she's here, she and her husband live in Washington, D.C., right, and has 2 sons and a couple of daughter-in-laws in tow. Now, she's an accomplished author, written many pieces about education, health, families and work, and travel for the Atlantic Monthly, National Geographic, the LA Times Magazine, Newsweek, and others. And her book, A Mother's Work, was published by Houghton Mifflin. Well, she's also had an academic career, worked at Georgetown University as assistant dean for the School of Languages and Linguistics. So she clearly knows whereof she speaks today. Okay. And if you haven't seen it, she has a great blog too, deborahfellows.com, which I thoroughly recommend. Anyone with an interest in language and its relationship to culture will, I think, find what we have to hear today and what you would find in the book absolutely enthralling. It's from what I've seen, a very extraordinary insight, portrayed in a very humble way, if I can say so. She takes the Chinese as they see and present themselves and discovers some very striking cultural differentiators. For instance, that what the Chinese think is important isn't always what we think is important. So, for instance, one thing that they're really, really interested in is ensuring good luck. So I'm crossing my fingers and hoping we've got all the stars properly aligned that this is going to be an auspicious event. So my introduction to our author, Deb Fallows.
Okay. Can you all hear me? Yes? Yes, great.
Louder.
Louder. Okay. Louder. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Please let me know if oh, straight up. Okay. Try to. Is that better? Yes. Okay. I will try to project. Thank you, Will. Thank you to the library, to the Asian American Society, to all the students and the staff in the bookstore and everybody who worked to put this together. I'm really delighted to be here. The good luck story, that's really interesting. I had kind of forgotten about this for a while. But when we lived in Shanghai, we lived in an apartment building where every month they would have something called a lucky draw. You know, you kind of draw the number of an apartment out of a big bowl of numbers. And whoever's number gets drawn gets some little prize of some sort. So once in about November, we won. And then in December, we also won, which was kind of unheard of. And this was like a life-changing experience for Jim and me, because suddenly everyone looked on us in a kind of new and different way, that we were lucky. We were really lucky people, and it seemed to be a great moral attribute to be lucky. And so I, highly recommend it to try to be lucky. I'd like to talk to you about 3 different things here today. One is how we got to China in the first place. The second is how I tried to study Mandarin. And the third is how the process of studying that language taught me a lot about China and the Chinese people and some of the cultures and customs. Jim, as Will said, my husband Jim is a journalist. He writes for the Atlantic Monthly. And we've had the great good fortune over our now 39 years of being married to live in a lot of different places around the world as he's done reporting. And we dragged our kids around and lived in Japan and Malaysia and England and West Africa and Texas and Seattle and just a bunch of places. So this last time, about 4 years ago, we decided it was time to hit the road again, and thought there would be no place more interesting in the world we could possibly try to see as China. So we tried to prepare for this experience. Jim was going again to report for the Atlantic Monthly, and I was very lucky to have my job at the Pew Internet Project be transportable in some sense. The Pew Project studies internet users in the US, and they said, okay, see what you can learn about internet users in China. So that was a great entree and really fun thing to do. So in preparation for this epic journey, we did everything we could to try to prepare ourselves, reading books, going to movies. I don't know if any of you remember way back then, but it was Mission Impossible 3 with Tom Cruise, set in Shanghai, and so that was kind of all we had known of modern Shanghai. I also tried to study the language, since that's my background and that's my kind of comfort zone. We knew we would need whatever we could get as far as Mandarin. So I went to the continuing ed and night program at Georgetown for about a year before we left to just get a little Mandarin under my belt. And in the end, after trying for a year or so to just prepare ourselves, we felt completely inadequate. We had a few ideas, but thought we'll just get on the plane for Shanghai, and we headed off. We had a rocky start. I mean, I know a lot of you have been in China, and you can imagine our experience of landing there and first just going through the everyday life things of setting up your life there. Where do you live? How do you eat? How do you get around? The transportation. How do you try to cross the street, which is a challenge in China in itself. Then about immediately after we got there, Jim drank some bad water, unintentionally, of course, and ended up miserably ill for the first 10 days. The winds from the Gobi Desert came roaring across at about 60 knots an hour for 10 days, and we thought, why didn't anyone mention the winds? It was like the Great Santa Anas in Southern California. And we were a little concerned, naively so, I suppose, that since Jim was a journalist, that maybe people would be watching us, maybe our apartment would be bugged. And it was quite interesting because we actually did find out that our apartment was not bugged, but people were watching us in a rather nice way. The authorities would invite us out to lunch periodically, just kind of track us and let us know so that we knew that they knew that we were there. And this little dance went on back and forth, but it was all very sociable, actually, and we made some nice friends with those who were watching us. my biggest surprise was when we first landed in Shanghai that I had an experience with the language I'd never had before, which was that I was completely, absolutely tongue-tied. I could not open my mouth and say anything. And I couldn't understand anything that anyone had said to me on the streets. And I thought maybe Meng Lao Shi, my teacher, had actually been teaching us Cantonese instead of Mandarin. A big joke on me. But of course, I later learned that there were two things kind of working against me there. One was that Shanghai has its own particular dialect. It's a Wu language, which is very, very different from Mandarin. It's a completely different language family, kind of like German is to English as Wu is to Mandarin. So that was a good excuse that I didn't understand things. But also, there is a very distinct Southern accent, a complete sound shift register in Shanghai versus Beijing. And my teacher, Meng Lao Shi, was from Beijing. So it took a while to get used to that whole shift of sounds. Mostly the S and SH and ch, ц, xie sounds are all shifted differently. It was like if he were from Boston, had been teaching me Chinese, and suddenly I woke up in Mobile, Alabama, and was supposed to speak English. It was quite different that way. So, but we did bit by bit get our bearings and find our way. And for me, I really began to engage and love this experience of learning Mandarin because it was such a different kind of language from any other I'd studied. It was not only a necessity for our daily life, but it was a lot of fun for me. So I tried to do everything I could to improve my meager skills. I found a school that was just up the street from where we lived, I love this school because of its name, and I am kind of embarrassed to admit I chose it for the name, which was Miracle Mandarin. So I thought, they can do it. We can do this together. And I watched a lot of TV. Soap operas were my favorite because they were very slow-going, a lot of context. They were always set in a hospital scene. Someone was always dying. Same conversations kind of over and over again. So I learned a lot that way. I talked to taxi drivers, made up errands, everything in my life was just on this mission. And I hung around little kids as much as I could, trailing them around because their language is so pure and so sweet and very clear. So I learned a lot just from overhearing them. The other reason I really loved this was that I found our life in China so overwhelming on a day-to-day basis that at least the process of studying the language was something I felt I could grab onto and had some control over. It was my one kind of staple in our everyday life there. And I'll just tell you a couple, my first two victories that I had in Chinese. The first was, these were real milestones for me. Nobody else would have noticed, but the day that I left our apartment building without my dictionary, which I was always tightly gripping to kind of get me through the day. I thought, okay, this is my destiny. Today I'm meant to be out on the street and get this errand done without my dictionary. And it worked. So I thought, I am on a roll. Miracle Mandarin is working, and we'll see where we go from here. The other thing that happened was that wonderful moment when you realize that something you've learned in your language class actually works on the street. So I just would like to read you a couple paragraphs of my wonderful epiphany when something was actually came true. Each morning, I would trace the same path to and from my school. Just before 10 in the morning, I crossed a dozen lanes of traffic under the busy overpass of Chengdu Road, continued up Nanjing Road, past the buildings of the Shanghai TV station. Every day, just after 1 o'clock, I retraced my steps home. Day after day, then week after week, my route took me past the same group of young guys who were selling knockoff goods on the sidewalk. Lady, lady, you buy my bag. Come look my warehouse. I have Gucci, I have Prada. Each time I dutifully slowed down and engaged for a moment, then declined with offers of buyao, 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 don't want, don't want, don't want. After so many passages, I knew each hawker well enough to tell who had gotten a new haircut, but they never seemed to recognize me. I was always just another mark. Finally, one day, I had enough. I snapped and dug for my new vocabulary. 昨天不要, 今天不要，明天不要. I shouted back, yesterday, don't want, today, don't want, tomorrow, don't want. They stopped cold, stunned. Then one irrepressible soul quickly recovered and with a plaintive look whispered earnestly, 后天, meaning day after tomorrow. So as I got a little bit better, bit by bit, I began to notice there were things in the language that caught my attention, like a word or a phrase or maybe just a bit of the grammar that really seemed bizarre for one reason or another. So I would first try to kind of follow the trail of that linguistically to try to explain, well, what was this that caught my attention and, what does it mean? Just to demystify it a little bit. And along the way of doing that, I realized that I was learning not only about the language, but also a lot of things about modern life in China. And they really became windows to me for understanding different things in China, like relationships or romance or behavior or protocol, or the dreams of the Chinese people. So I'd like to explain a couple of those, of just what I mean by this. The first place to start has to be, I think, with tones, which are, of course, the nemesis of every non-tone language person who's trying to learn Mandarin. And I thought, why are they so hard for me to hear? Why are they so hard to say? Why can't I remember them? Why can't the Chinese ever understand my tones? And why would a language even have tones? Anyway, so it was a really interesting kind of linguistic exercise where I learned that I think this really starts with the syllable structure of Chinese, which is very minimalist. It's just consonant vowel. That's basically it. There are only 400 of them. Bu, hao, ta, shi, ni, and so forth. 400 possibilities, as opposed to English, which has about 4,000 different syllable structures. A vowel and all kinds of consonants on either side, like stretched or trusts. So in the lexicon, in the vocabulary of Chinese, when you have only these 400 possibilities where a word will just be one syllable or maybe two of them put together, you can imagine the opportunity for homonyms where you say one syllable and it can mean so many different things, so many possible words. So actually, when you think about it, putting tones onto those syllables is a really clever way to get a lot of mileage out of the system. So if you have a syllable like ma, M-A, ma, if you put a high tone on it, ma, it means one thing, mother. If you put a falling, rising tone on it, it means another thing, like horse. Or if you put a falling tone on it, ma, it means actually a word like to swear or to curse. So it is a wonderful, you don't eliminate the homonym problem entirely. In fact, I used to have this kind of game I'd play where it's not really a very fun game, but I'd open my dictionary and just land on some random syllable word and see how many words were really, how many different words with different meanings came out of that one syllable. Usually it was like 3 pages of words out of a single syllable, and then there's sh, which had about 11 pages. So I really came to think this was a problem because for us, you'd think we really should be able to hear these tones better because we have them in a sense in English when you are asking a question, like going out, it's raining, taking your hat, where the sound goes up, the tone rises at the end of the sentence. We all know that that signifies a question. So we have that concept of rising tones and falling tones. But for us, it's all about this. You've got one semantic rule. Put a rising tone in the last word in the sentence and you've got yourself a question. Whereas in Chinese, it's just this arbitrary learning. Why should ma with a high tone mean one thing and ma mean another thing? It's just a lot of memorization to try to connect the syllables with the proper tones and remember what that means. So not only we're not used to hearing this or paying attention to it where it's really critical, and we're not used to saying it, and and we're not used to the sense that it's all arbitrary. So it is pretty tough for us. I found it really frustrating, like every Westerner, I think, when I knew I had nailed a tone with a word, and somehow it just didn't work. It still didn't work. They couldn't understand me. And like pretty much everyone in China, I have a humiliating tone experience. Everybody's got a story of what they did with tones and kind of made a total fool of yourself. So I'll read you mine. After several months in China, I had developed a bad craving for cheese, which is a precious and hard-to-find luxury in this highly lactose-intolerant nation. Desperate, I stopped in a Taco Bell at the fringe of swanky downtown Shanghai, fixed on the idea of a gooey, sloppy, cheesy burrito. A tall Chinese youth, proudly wearing a black sombrero and sequined velvet vest, greeted me at the entrance. He barked a hearty "Huan Yin Guanling," like Will said, "Welcome, come on in." Happens every time you go in a restaurant. Still quite new to China, I had rehearsed my lines to ask for the menu and inquire about takeout. "Yo da bao ma, do you have takeout?" I said. When the greeter in the sombrero looked puzzled, I asked again, pointing to the menu, pointing to the door, miming the act of carrying my bag out the door. No response. So I cut out the grammar and simply said, "Da bao," takeout, nothing. Then I tried all sorts of tones on the two syllables of da bao. High tones, rising tones, falling, rising tones, various combinations thereof. All the time I'm thinking, come on, guy, work with me here. How hard can this be? He called for reinforcements from the kitchen. Several more young boys in sombreros emerged, listened intently as I repeated da bao over and over again. Finally, one erupted in triumph. "Ah, da bao?" This uttered with a very emphatic high tone on the bao. The greeter solemnly answered, "Yo, we have it." And then they all laughed and went back into the kitchen. So, never the twain shall meet on this. So I, of course, ran home to my dictionary trying to figure out what in the world I'd been asking all the time. That it could have been so many things. And I think one of them means, like, can you give me a big hug? When trying to figure out why this is so hard to make the leap of imagination for the Chinese to try to get a sense of what are we saying when we're not saying it just right or what they're quite anticipating. And I think the answer is that in Chinese, that when you're a Mandarin speaker, and this is how you learn from the get-go, the integration, it's not just about the sounds of a syllable like it is for us, but it's about that integration of the tone and the sound together that's just impossible to separate. And until you've maybe had a lot of exposure to foolish foreigners or a lot of experience kind of thinking about this, it's just not in the imagination to leap to, what are the other 20 possibilities she's possibly trying to say? So there is this kind of impasse between the two systems, whereas, for us, it's just way too much arbitrary learning with the tones, and for the Chinese, it's the impossibility to separate. But it is a kind of really humbling experience to appreciate that, but it finally, strips out the frustration. I think they're not just trying to frustrate me by not understanding my tones, and I'm certainly not trying to frustrate them, and it kind of helps you with the exchanges that you have with people. I'll tell you about one other thing. Here's another example. So I often had this sense when I was trying to speak Mandarin that I was feeling very abrupt in my manner of speaking, even to the point of being rude. Say you're in a restaurant here in the U.S. and the waiter or waitress comes to you and said, "Would you like a glass of water?" We might go on and say, "Oh, no, thanks. I'm not really thirsty now. I might have some a little later. Thanks very much. Not now. Thanks. Thanks." In China, if you're in a restaurant and the waiter comes and asks you, "Would you like a glass of water?" 不要, don't want, don't need. Extremely abrupt, just like with that hawker on the street. And it's our inclination to kind of elaborate a little more and soften the language like we do in English with a lot of pleases and thank yous and coulds and shoulds and woulds and mights and all these things that kind of just plump up our English. But I knew that in Chinese, this wasn't what you do. You just say, get it out there, 不要, don't want. So I'd have this funny experience of seeing a kind of contradiction of what was going on. Again, let's go back to the restaurant. If I was in a restaurant in China, there was a table of people next to me, I would see very polite behavior going on, and yet, on the other hand, hear what sounded like really impolite language being spoken, and trying to put those two together and get a sense of what it was. So in this restaurant, maybe there would be a table of good friends all having dinner. The host at the table would be pouring the beer for everybody else and then pouring for himself. Maybe the hostess would be choosing the nicest morsels of vegetables from one of the dishes on the table, serving everyone else's little plate, and then serving herself. So this happened, every time you wanted to drink, you had to pour for everybody else before yourself. So it was a very prescribed way of behaving that obviously looked very polite to me. Then in the midst of it, I might hear someone blurt out something like, 给我盐, give me the salt, the equivalent of give me the salt. And it was, especially if there's a family, it was all I could do to stop from running up there and say, give me the salt, please. Like you might be trying to train your children. So I would ask many of my Chinese friends, what's going on here? And tried to look through, again, my crutch was these arcane linguistic texts to get some explanations of why this contrast between politeness and what I perceived as impolite kind of language. And I found a couple interesting things that were reinforced by the comments of my Chinese friends. My Chinese friends say that they notice that Westerners use lots of pleases and thank yous when speaking Chinese. And actually, they say we use way too many of them for Chinese taste. A Chinese linguist named Kai Zhan says that in a phrase, using a please in a phrase such as please pass the salt actually has the opposite effect of politeness here in China. The Chinese way of being polite to each other with words is to shorten the social distance between you, and saying please actually serves to insert a kind of buffer or space that says, in effect, we need some formality here between us. One of my tutors was this young, really cool guy named Danny. He was, on the one hand, he was a very Chinese nationalist spiritually, and on the other hand, he was a very edgy global modern youth. He had a faux hawk, which was very fashionable at that time. So I asked him about this interpretation, and he nodded his head enthusiastically when I asked and said, yeah, good friends are so close, they're like part of you. Why would you say please or thank you to yourself? So when, I think the moral of this story and what this taught me was that my complex understanding of how the culture and the language fit together around politeness was a very Western and American sensibility, and it didn't match up at all with what I was seeing and what I was hearing in China, which was a great learning experience. So I'll give you one more brief example of this kind of language and culture difference that I noticed. This is about a single word, ai, which means to love. I first noticed something funny going on with this word about 25 years ago. Jim and I had been living in Japan and Malaysia in the mid-'80s, and we had our two then small boys with us. We had the great opportunity, it's a long story, but we ended up in China for about a month between Japan and Malaysia with a group of the World Congress of Esperanto speakers who were having a big conference in Beijing and throughout China during that time. And somehow they invited us, and somehow we learned a little Esperanto, and we took our boys and we went to China. So that was really something, because it was just 10 years after the Cultural Revolution, and China was seeing foreigners in China, especially these two little blonde boys, we were kind of attracted a lot of attention. So along the way in southern China, I met this Chinese woman, and I think she was an Esperantist too, but we were talking, and we got to talking about families and so forth, and she was kind of sizing me up and looking at our two little boys, and she said to me, "Which one do you love more?" And I was completely taken aback, because this is just not a question I have ever heard, of course. And I said, well, you know, a little bit offended, I said, "I love them both the same." She said, kind of nodded and said, "Yeah, but really, which one do you love more?" So we went back and forth on this, just like a ping pong ball, and she would say that, and I would say, "I love them both the same," and we never got to an end of this conversation, of course, but I remembered it. And then when we went back to China 20 years later, my ears first perked up when I heard some more funny things about the word love going on. We ended up having a lot of friends who were mixed couples, a Chinese half and a Western half of our adult friend couples. And often, as we got to know them better and would have these just various conversations, this one conversation would happen where we'd be talking about some stuff about language, and the Western half of the couple would say, "Oh, you know, my Chinese wife, she'll never say I love you. She just won't say it in Mandarin. She won't say it in English. She cannot utter those words, I love you." And it's so frustrating. And then the Chinese half of the couple would say, "Oh, my husband, he just says, I love you, I love you, I love you," all the time. Completely meaningless, so gratuitous. Why does he just say such a hollow thing to me? So I'm thinking, you know, there it is again. This use of love is going in opposite directions. And I had one more experience, which was spending some time in Beijing with a young woman. She was probably in her mid-30s, had one little kid, had a job, had a husband, had 4 grandparents taking care of the kids. Everything seemed great. So we got to talking about relationships, and she said, "You know, you've been married a long time." I said, "Yeah, we've been married a long time." She said, "You must love your husband very much." And I thought, odd, you know. "Oh, yes, I love him very much." And you have to kind of say something back, and I didn't know what to say. I just said, "I'm sure you must love your husband very much too." And she said, "I love him for now." And again, it kind of stopped me in my tracks, and I thought, first I thought, she's telling me this, you know, I barely know her. Would her family think if they heard her saying this to me? And then tried to search for some kind of linguistic explanation for this, which I don't really have a foolproof linguistic explanation, except that, you know, in many ways Chinese is a very minimalist language. No inflections, no conjugations, no declensions, no gender, no agreement. It's just simple. So with a word like love, you don't get the present and the past, and you don't get all the complicated ways you can put some time frame around things. And I thought maybe this was one of those things that was kind of lost in translation, and she was trying to say in some more existential way or romantic way, like I am in love with him, or that was the best alternative I could come up with, and think maybe that I love him for now was just like her miscue with the English to me, and my miscue with hearing something back, and she meant something quite different. So in just doing some reading and looking around about love and marriage in China, I think possibly the kind of historical explanation and genesis of love and marriage has a lot to do with the explanation too. That back in imperial times and in dynastic times, and when Confucianism was very strong in China, the idea of love and marriage was much more formal. Marriages were arranged. They were all about obedience and harmony and just a kind of stricter, less personal sense of things. Fast forward to the era of Chairman Mao, when there was a much more political overlay and maybe a little bit of romantic love, but much more, this is for the masses, this is for the good of the state, and still prescribed in a different way. And then now, where it feels like there's a whole lot going on with the idea of love and marriage in modern China, which is kind of everything. You can find anything all at once. A revival of the Confucianism a bit, and a very modern sense of love from young people, of course. And I'll just read one more tiny thing, which is what we saw on a single day that just shows you how much is going on with this sense of love and marriage in China. This was from the spring of 2009 when we were living in Beijing. The Cherry Blossom Spring Flower Festival this year happened to coincide with the first gloriously warm, clear weekend days of the season. All of Beijing was out of doors after the dark, dank, and dreary winter. On Sunday at Yuyuantan Park on the west side of the city, boys bought their girls sprigs of bright pink and white plastic cherry blossoms, which the girls wound into wreaths and wore in their hair. The lake was crowded with pedal boats, and farmers sold baby chicks and bunnies from cardboard boxes. Everyone was paired off, or so it seemed. Young couples filled the subways in the parks that day, all locked in embrace. They held hands, they hugged, they kissed, they embraced, they spooned, all mindless or careless of their public display. I would say that these are the youth of the Marry for Love generation. On that same day, had we been in Shanghai's People's Park instead, we would no doubt have again seen the serious matchmaking meetings that we observed there every weekend we lived in Shanghai. Parents in their 50s worried about their unmarried offspring in their late 20s. They would gather in the northwest corner of the park with their homemade signs describing their children. This son was born in the year of the monkey, 1.8 meters tall, had a job in a small private company, was type A blood. That daughter was a graduate of East China Normal University, 1.6 meters tall, type A blood, Han ethnic group. The parents would circle around tentatively, reading each other's posters, huddling with their spouses, and perhaps sidling toward another couple to strike up a conversation and see where things might go from there. The grown children were never in evidence. Who knows? They may have been locked in embrace in the number 2 subway line at that very moment. These were adults of another era, and they were trying to arrange marriages for their very modern youth. So what that really explained to me, or what that came to mean to me, was love was really kind of a metaphor for so much that you see changing in China right now, just kind of organic changes around a lot of different things. And certainly one of them is this sense of romance and marriage in China. So that's kind of my story. It was about how language came to be my way into the culture. First it was survival, and it was functional. And then later it just became my passion and my telescope into explaining things that I would see that puzzled me on the street, or explaining some concepts that I would see about Chinese life, whether it was about love and romance or behavior or rudeness or just about a lot of things. So thank you very much.
I just want to thank everyone for coming again, and the Asian American Center for co-sponsoring. So just let you guys know, her book, Dreaming in Chinese, will be right outside and you can sell. And I'm sure she'd be happy to sign copies as well.
And to take questions right now?
Sure, we can do that if you'd like.
All the way over here in the back.
Okay.
So I have a question, and you may recognize my voice. I have
I can't.
Sue. So here's my question.
Okay, Sue. This is my sister-in-law. This is not a planted question. This is a total surprise.
So you described how tones have so many different meanings for a syllable. So how does that translate to the written character? How can you tell what you're reading and the way to speak it and the meaning? Is the character not assigned to one of those 400?
Okay, you have, let's just take a syllable. You have the syllable ma. If it's a high tone ma, it has one character. If you can read that character, you know that it's ma. It all goes together. If you have ma, the word for horse, it happens to have a falling rising tone. You don't see that in the character, but you see the character that you know means ma, horse. So you have the pairings there, but when you're reading it, you have, if you're reading the characters, there's no hint of what the tone difference is. But if you're Chinese, you just know that that's what it is. There's another, there's a kind of crutch which is a phonetic alphabet that has been, Chinese has had a number of phonetic alphabets tried, and the latest one is Pinyin, which is now generally taught in schools, uses our same Roman alphabet, and it would be written, like the word ma would be written M-A, and it would have a tone mark, a diacritic, either a straight line or a slash or a little caret over it. So if you were reading that and knew that tone system, you could read that. So you've got, this is why it's just, there's so much work that goes into a single word. You've got the sound, you've got the tone that goes with the sound, you've got the character, you've got the phonetic alphabet with the little tone mark on it, and then you've got to remember that and what it means, by the way, that it means stone or lion or to be or to make. Those are all versions of shi. So that was an astonishing thing and really taxing thing about trying to learn Mandarin, to have all of those pieces come together at one time. You don't need to say thank you. No thank you necessary. Yes?
Hello. I'm tutoring American people to learn Mandarin right now. Sometimes I figure out maybe we have some difficulty remember the thing you mentioned.
The tone?
Yeah, the tone and the character together. So I make it simple, just learn by oral language. Is that word better, or have to learn by character and the tones and ordering?
Oh, okay. So this is like different teaching methods to try for us to remember what the tones are. And you said by oral method, so you repeat a word over and over and over again, which to me is the absolute best method. The best teacher I had was one who would, if we were getting a new word that we were learning that day, the teacher would repeat that word, I don't know, 30 times, 300 times, 330 times, so that it eventually kind of sounds right. Trust me, it's still really hard to remember that from one day to the next. But one of the things I did was I had a survey of my own that I would ask everyone trying to learn the language, what's your system? How do you remember this? And I heard people had great systems. One of my teachers actually had a kind of aerobic system for teaching us. So imagine, this was at Miracle Mandarin. We're in class for 3 hours a day. So every time she taught us a new word, if it was a high tone, she'd be up like this. Falling, rising tone would be going like this, or rising tone would be like this. So we were just kind of dancing our way through class. It was completely exhausting class. After 90 minutes, we'd all need a coffee and start all over again. Not very effective, I might say, but my favorite one was from some of my artsy friends. They called it the colors method. Here's how it works. You yourself assign a color to a tone, something that kind of makes sense to you, like maybe red. Maybe a falling tone is red, I thought, like a stop sign. Maybe a falling, rising tone is like a wave. So I said, OK, that'll be blue. Then every time you learn a new word, you visualize it in that color tone. So theoretically, this is great. You're learning a word. You're thinking in colors for what a word is. And some of my very artistic friends said that this worked for them. They were kind of visualizing Chinese in colors all the time. For me, it was a complete failure because I could never remember my system. I could never remember which tone was which color, which word was which color, and it was just a fifth thing to try to remember. So I'm completely with you. I think it may not be fun, but the most effective way is just over and over and over again, like le and la, in French, where it finally sounds right or doesn't sound right. Sometimes you're right, sometimes you're not right, but yes, sir, right.
I'll go back to the idea of language and culture they spoke about. Is there any situations where it's appropriate to actually use the nice words that we have, like thank you and please, or is it just more about action rather than words? How to be nice?
It is in more formal situations, and certainly in the. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay, when do you use the pleases and thank yous and the softeners in the language in Chinese? Yes, it is. It is more appropriate in formal situations where you're not good friends or not close buddies, like in meetings or at formal dinners or with people you don't know very well and are trying to behave better, or in a more strict format. But the general, with your friends or on the street or with waiters or in the shops, it's just not there. You know, partly it's the pleases and thank yous, but it's also partly an affect of, or a situation of the Mandarin language that all of these extra little words we throw in, would you like to, rather than just do this, they aren't there to the same extent. And you know, this is not a foolproof situation. Think of in English, for example, in our family unit, as we are now, just Jim and me. Every Wednesday night, I might say to him, would you like to take out the trash? It's trash night. And he's, well, I wouldn't like to take out the trash. If you want me to take out the trash, ask me to take out the trash, please. So it's this little skirmish between, I'm trying to be polite because I don't want to order him around and say, take out the trash. And he's getting annoyed because, of course, he wouldn't like to take out the trash, interpreting this very literally. Just say, just ask me to take out the trash. So, you know, we actually do some of that too, and it's probably a more complex system of niceties and politenesses, but every language has them to an extent, and it just seems much more magnified in Mandarin to me. Yes, ma'am.
How have you seen your experience in China play out back home in America as you see Western culture instead?
Okay, so how do I observe Western culture since I've been back, or how do I fit into Western culture?
How do you see the cultures interact here?
You mean with Chinese? How does the culture? How do I see Chinese people doing here? Or
yeah, and how you view like interactions between Chinese people and Western people.
oh, well.
Please brought insight to that.
Okay, so just how does this play out in America or in the West between Chinese and Westerners? I suppose I just kind of skate around this answer because I find it's extremely hard to try to get this perception into your own culture, because so much of what you do every day is just how you began doing this, and it seems like the givens of the behaviors and protocols of your own language. So it's really hard to look, it's much harder to look into your own language and own culture than it is to be in the middle of a foreign culture. And I'd actually rather throw that question back to a few of the Chinese in people in the audience to say, you know, what are one or two things that you might notice about American behavior that kind of put you off in the same sense? Is maybe our seeming niceness is not really very nice or does not seem genuine. Actually, now that you mention that, one thing I think of is I've been on the West Coast for about the last 10 days, and now I've just come back to the East Coast. And I was overhearing on the train yesterday some poor guy who said he'd been on the train for 8 days. He started in Alaska, going down the West Coast, came across the country, and now he was in Hartford yesterday. And he was saying, you know, on the West Coast, they always say people are really nice, but they just sound nice, and they're not really nice. They just say nice things to you. When you get to, I'm so relieved to get back to the East Coast because people don't try to hide that they're not nice. They just say it to you right off, and there's no pretending that they're not nice. They're just not nice. So nobody's nice, but they say it differently in the two places, which I thought was really funny. I mean, that's kind of an example of what you're saying. Any answers from the Chinese in the audience of something that you might notice? And feel free to insult or...
Actually, I just want to say something about you say, not the close family say thank you or please all the time. I think it depends different area or different family culture thing. Since my family always say thank you, and please. So I don't think that this is strange.
Yeah, I've heard, well, I think it's from people I've heard lately talking about the pleases and thank yous in China. It does seem that there are some regional differences. People in Taiwan have said, well, we always say please and thank you.
Yeah.
Where are you from?
Guangzhou.
Guangzhou. Okay, which is in the in the south. Right. So I'm sure, you know, there are, that in some sense there are generalizations. I hear a lot more response that, oh, that's right, you know, we never say please, we never say thank you, from people than kind of the more complex picture of it. And it isn't an absolute. But I'll tell you, it took me, after we'd been in China for about 1.5 years, I realized I did not know how to say please. And I had to go look it up in my dictionary. I was just saying thank you, and I kind of overcompensating by saying thank you, thank you, thank you to everything, and getting no response. But it's so. But thank you for that comment. Yes. Maybe one last question, if anybody has it.
Right in front.
Oh, yes, sir.
Yes, you lived in Japan in the 1980s, you mentioned.
Correct.
Can you compare your kind of daily life experience in Tokyo with China?
Yes, okay, so how does life in China and life in Japan compare? Really interesting differences. And I guess a couple of the biggest points. In Japan, there are such formalized ways of doing everything. And it was different. We were there with our little kids. They were going to a Japanese public school. We were in a Japanese neighborhood. I always felt like I was walking around with a sandwich board that may have said, I'm Western, you know, I'm American, I'm doing it all wrong, just come at me, you know, let me have it. No matter how hard I tried to do the right thing, it was never right, and it was fairly unforgiving. It wore me down. It wore us down of always doing the wrong thing. It was a very polite society, but I found it harder to live there as a Westerner for all those reasons. When we were in China, and when we went to China after 1.5 years in Japan on that trip with the Esperanto speakers, it was like this tremendous sense of relief off our shoulders that we were like the Chinese. You know, I think there is a certain kinship between Americans and Chinese, a lightheartedness, a kind of outgoingness, and a much more acceptance of your faux pas that you make all over the place. We were certainly breaking rules, whether they were cultural rules, social rules, whatever kind of rules, all over the place. But it didn't seem to matter. And during this last time in China, I would say that it was a real relief to be there as an American, because we could go around with a certain sense of anonymity. You know, it's not that there were that many Westerners there, but the Chinese were just so busy with their own lives and improving their lot or working at their jobs or whatever it was that they noticed us. They were just kind of on about their business, and there was no sense that you were on stage the same way. So it was very easy to just kind of move along. And I would say, just as a footnote, especially to be an American in that situation, you know, usually if you're an American abroad, you feel like you're carrying the weight of the society on your shoulders, and you have to be an American, and people can kind of tell you're American. In China, that wasn't the case. The first question you always hear on the streets from Chinese is, oh, where are you from? And you get really sick of answering that question, so I started to ask people back, well, where do you think I'm from? and they would go through a litany of possibilities. You're from France. You're from Germany. You're from Scandinavia, England, Australia, Canada. And much more often than not, they would never guess the US or America. And I'd finally say, well, I'm from the US. And, oh, and then kind of go on about your business. But I thought it was very curious that right now in China, there was not the assumption that the Westerners there were Americans. I didn't somehow seem American. They didn't even put it on the list of the possible nationalities I might be. I never did quite sort that out, but it happened again and again and again. So Thank you very much for coming. Spending your lunchtime here. I appreciate it. Thank you.